Greetings in the name of our Lord Jesus. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us, full of grace and truth. And from his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. John chapter 1, verses 14 and 16. The writing of history is uniquely human activity. Only man can look back upon his past experience and attempt to discover the many strands which have been woven together into the fabric of his present existence. Some say that history is simply the record of man's wars, his inhumanity to his fellow man and himself. Others say it is a listing of man's great discoveries or progress that have led him to his present situation. Both of these views are true to a point. However, the history of the church must be something more than either of these views. The history of the church and of this congregation must bear witness to something more than just the activity of man, either good or evil. It must be a statement of faith, a creed that testifies to the greater activity of God, the Lord of history, in our midst through the years. There's nothing permanent or enduring about human existence. The only lasting quality to which we can point as a source of strength and hope for this congregation through the years is the promised presence of God at work in the midst of our feeble attempts to be and become a community of faithful witnesses. The history of St. John Evangelical Lutheran Church, when all else is written of the men and times of which we are a part, can finally say only this: and of his fullness we have received grace upon grace. Pastor Luther Gantner, 1965. The sixth President of the United States was John Quincy Adams. Ohio was very young, having been admitted to the Union only 24 years previously, in 1803. Beautiful Ohio in the early 1800s was a vast forest of oak, beech, ash, and elm trees. Surveyors made notches in the trees as a witness, establishing corners at quarter-mile and half-mile points. Here then, in a few years, and after many blistered and calloused hands wielding the axe and hoe, the settlers made little clearings here and there for a log cabin and a little field or garden. Into this new world of wonder came German immigrants in considerable numbers in 1827 to settle in a community which was to be known as Windfall. About 6 miles south of Windfall in Marlborough Township, better known as Water Hill and many years later as a Delaware Reservoir area, lived a man whose name was Henry Klein. Mr. Klein operated a sawmill and was also interested in bringing the good news of Jesus Christ and his saving grace to the settlers establishing their homes in this part of Ohio. He was concerned enough to walk from Marlborough Township to an area about 2 miles west of the Windfall Church on Newman's Cardington Road East. There, a log church was built and was commonly known as the Barringer Log Church. There began the history of the Windfall congregation. At first, Mr. Klein came only every 2 weeks and preached the gospel for whatever the offering was for that Sunday. The first baptism was performed on September 5th, 1833. Caroline Jacoby was baptized on that date by a Mr. I. Cronick. The following is quoted from the Marion County History of Brevities, a local newspaper column. The Lutheran Church formed a society in Richland Township in 1835, holding the first meetings in private residences, barns, and groves. In 1838, the Society and the German Reformed Church together erected a house of worship on a piece of land donated to them by John Jacoby Jr. The building was of logs, and here the Lutherans continued to worship for many years. It was on March 6, 1836, that a special bill had been passed by the Ohio legislature in the Senate and the House to incorporate Jacob's Evangelical Lutheran and German Reformed Church in Richland, in the county of Marion. By May of 1836, Pastor Klein had instructed 162 people whom he felt were eligible for confirmation. Following are words shared by retired Pastor Donald Pletcher on the 180th anniversary of the congregation. Did you ever wonder what it was like for the pioneer settlers who cleared the land and built their first log homes 180 years ago? The story is told that the nickname Windfall was coined about that time because the early settlers to this area found a large swath of trees already blown down by a fierce windstorm. Those fallen trees became a blessing. and the settlers were able to move quickly to build their cabins, log church, and clear the land for their crops. Blessed with sturdy and sound bodies, the early Lutheran pioneers were reported to carry 3 books with them as they migrated to the New World. They brought their Bibles, a hymnal, and a book of sermons. With those books, they could meet for worship while they waited for the Lutheran pastors who were making their rounds to each new settlement. The blessings multiplied and the congregation grew. The log church was followed by a white frame building in the 1860s, where the assembled congregation came together to celebrate, give thanks for God's blessings, and receive God's gifts in the water of baptism and the bread of wine of Holy Communion. The same minister served the Lutheran and Reformed congregations until 1846. Both congregations continued to use the same building, and the official acts of each congregation appeared in the same church record books. There were 2 services held on Sundays, and each week the Lutheran and Reformed congregations would alternate morning and afternoon services. There was a keen interest in mission work in those early days. For instance, an entry of September 23, 1849 reads, "Paid out of the treasury $4 to the Reverend Thomas H. Winters for missionary purposes by the Church Council." On October 26, 1922, the Dorcas Society was formed, and that was a successor organization to the Frauenverein, which was a German women's association that sought to care for destitute widows, orphans, and sick persons. Caring for the poor and marginalized is in the DNA of this congregation, and is what they mean when they say they are sent into the community to share the love of Jesus. At a turbulent time in U.S. history when some southern states had seceded from the Union and a dark and bloody war loomed ahead, it was just a year before Abraham Lincoln was chosen president that the Lutheran congregation worshiping in the old Barringer Church began thinking about building a church of their own. The dreaming and thinking and planning lasted for 7 years, until finally they began to achieve their goal. An acre of ground for the church site was given by George Yake. This plot was located at what is now the corner of Newman's Cardington Road East and the Clarendon Westfield Road. The cornerstone for the frame church at Windfall was laid in 1867. The Reformed congregation would build a new church building in 1881. That would become St. Jacob's Reformed Church. This congregation is no longer active, and their abandoned church building was struck by lightning in 1836 and burned. As airplanes were taking off in 1905, the church went through a remodel. In 1916, the church building was raised and basement rooms were added. From 1917 on, Windfall would experience some difficult times. There was the conflict of World War I, followed by the Great Depression. Households were hard-pressed to feed and clothe growing children. Church trustees sought monetary support for the congregation, wanting $3 per confirmed member, and that was not always forthcoming. The pastor's salary was sometimes paid in hams or chickens or other produce. In 1937, a traumatic event in the life of the congregation took place. The death of their beloved pastor, George Schuliger, 26 years old, who had come to Windfall only a little more than a year previously, and whose body lies buried in the church cemetery. On Sunday, May 16, 1937, just 5 days before he died, he officiated a confirmation service. Members of the congregation long remembered his message based on Revelation chapter 2, verse 10. "Be thou faithful unto death, and I will give thee the crown of life." The congregation continued to grow, more than doubling their attendance by 1940. During World War II, members saw their sons leave for war, but fortunately all returned safely after the conflict was over. In 1959, St. John Windfall saw some significant changes. A new hymnal, the service book and hymnal, was introduced. An acre of land was purchased to enlarge the cemetery. And in June of 1959, St. John's Lutheran took another giant step forward with the decision to build a new church edifice. The need for a new place of worship was prompted by the growing number in attendance at both church and Sunday school. In 1960, St. John's Lutheran Church Windfall was numbered among the 4,902 congregations to form a new church body. The American Lutheran Church, which combined three former Lutheran church bodies: the American Lutheran Church, the Evangelical Lutheran Church, and the United Evangelical Lutheran Church. The union brought together for the first time in that century major Lutheran church bodies of different national heritage: German, Norwegian, and Danish. In 1963, the Lutheran Free Church would merge with the American Lutheran Church. Construction of the new church building began in 1967, and worship services commenced in March of '68. It didn't take long for the congregation to pay off their 15-year loan, which was $60,000 borrowed on a $100,000 project, paying it off in 7 years. To celebrate such an occasion, the congregation held a note-burning ceremony. The following is a story written by Howard Clapper, written in 1968. There is a church by the side of the road, a church whose tower bell has called the faithful to worship ever since 1835, when the Lutheran Church organized a society to save a community called Windfall. Along a country road, midway between the town of Cardington and Marion, Windfall is a community where the forests were cleared and the land put to plow by hardy German folk seeking richer opportunities in the new Ohio country. Giant oaks, skillfully honed into sturdy logs, soon became the community's first church. Thus the work began. Decade after decade, generation after generation, the work continues. Ever in the mainstream of community life, Windfall Lutheran Church for nearly a century and a half has remained steadfast, immovable, abounding in the work of the Lord. Through its friendly door, thousands have come to worship, to meditate, to marry, to baptize, to bury loved ones. The hunter, the miller, the woodsman, the farmer, the bonneted pioneer mother, the 20th century homemaker, the engineer, the teacher, the executive, all have come to the church by the side of the road, a church called Windfall. A church is people. It is an endless stream of humanity moving across the centuries. Like the river unable to fill the sea, St. John's Lutheran Church, the people of the congregation called Windfall, will, we believe, continue their unending work for a better world exemplified by the creed and the faith that is their heritage. The early 20th century saw the establishment of many ministries at St. John Lutheran Church, Windfall. Luther League, which would be the congregation's youth ministry, began in 1907. In 1936, there was a Better Christian Fellowship Society, which was an organization for young married people. The Women's Missionary Society was formed on October 12, 1939. This was a women's organization and would be the predecessor organization to WELCA, also known as the Women of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. The first Vacation Bible School was held in 1936, and it was a 2-week session with 17 in attendance. There were some years where Vacation Bible School would run 3 weeks in the summer. At the 10-year anniversary of the new church building in 1978, the Reverend Howard Strobel was pastor. He told the congregation that the future is an open door for more and closer fellowship with God. He pondered whether God and church was still the center of our lives, or if other things had crept in to ruin this wonderful heritage. Now, the word heritage would come up much when going through the research and history of this congregation. To this day, people can trace their family lineage back. Many can still find relatives in the pews on Sunday morning. However, when the word heritage comes up in the recorded history, it seems to always point to the heritage of faith, centered in Jesus Christ. In the 1970s and 80s, the congregation would continue to discern its present and future. As a charismatic movement was influencing congregations and Christians in the area, nationally, Lutherans would be gearing up to discuss merger once again, bringing together different strands and pieties of Lutheranism into one large denomination. This work began in 1982. 3 Lutheran church bodies were working to unite to form a new denomination that would be called the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. The American Lutheran Church, the Lutheran Church in America, and the Association of Evangelical Lutheran Churches would take a vote at each of their conventions in August of 1986. This was approved by each church body, and on January 1st, 1988, Evangelical Lutheran Church in America came into existence. Also in 1988, St. John Lutheran Windfall called the Reverend Donald Fletcher to be their next pastor, and to date he would be their longest-serving pastor, retiring on July 12, 2009. During Pastor Fletcher's tenure, the parsonage was rebuilt due to a fire. An outer narthex was added to the sanctuary. A shelter house was built on the campus, and a new hymnal, the Lutheran Book of Worship, was introduced. In 2017, a time capsule was opened to mark the 50th anniversary of the current church building. Many treasures from the past were found in it, including pictures and letters. In a letter that Pastor Fletcher wrote for the time capsule, he reflected on some of the major events his family and the congregation had experienced up to this point, which was only 3 years into his pastorate here at St. John Windfall. Memories included the rebuilding of the parsonage that was struck by lightning, the construction of a bell tower, the raising of the bell that was once in the belfry of the old church. Pastor Fletcher also shared a dark time in the history of the congregation. There was a lawsuit filed in 1991 that exposed sexual abuse by a former pastor and that had taken place between July of 1962 and January of 1965. In reflecting on the words from 1 John chapter 4, verse 7, "Beloved, let us love one another," Pastor Fletcher felt that the congregation responded to this horrific news with love and Christian concern for those involved. The sharing of the good and bad is a reminder of those words from Pastor Garner back in 1965, that the history of the church and of this congregation must bear witness to something more than just the activity of man, either good or evil. It must be a statement of faith, a creed that testifies to the greater activity of God, the Lord of history, in our midst through the years. This is precisely what Pastor Fletcher was recording when he wrote his letter for this time capsule. That this congregation has been and continues to be a community of faith called to love one another, and doing so knowing that God is in our midst in both the good times and the bad. In 2011, the current pastor, the Reverend Adam Sorchai, was called to serve the congregation right out of seminary, ordained and installed at St. John Lutheran Church, Windfall, on the Feast of the Nativity of St. John the Baptist on June 24, 2011. Another chapter in the life of the congregation was underway. New ministries would emerge, and another hymnal, the Evangelical Lutheran Worship, would be introduced. At a time when church membership and engagement in religious practices are shrinking in North America, St. John's is in the midst of a building expansion project to build a larger kitchen, to have a new fellowship hall and restrooms, in order to carry out its mission, but also to care for the house that has been so good to the church, that has gathered in this place for over 50 years. Since 1835, there is an acknowledgement by the people of St. John Windfall that the world is changing around them, and while this can be stressful, the future can bring about some anxiety, this community always moves forward in joyful hope. For there is truth to the saying that the more things change, the more things stay the same. This congregation has, at its core, a sense that it can endure just about anything, knowing that God is in their midst. From those pioneer days with that missionary and evangelical spirit, to enduring rough times in the 20th century and certainly experiencing uncertainty in the 21st, we continue to be filled with a sense of wonder in what God is going to do for us next. This is a community that is proud of its history, proud of its heritage, but does not worship the past. Its history is a testament to a people, a great cloud of witnesses that is always looking forward to what God is blessing them with next, while always remembering what God has already blessed them with in their past and present. Since 1835, this congregation has adhered to God's call to be faithful, and that the history of this church, St. John Lutheran Church Windfall, isn't about what they've accomplished, but what God has blessed them with. This is a people whose mission is to be centered in the Word, strengthened in the sacraments, and sent into the community to share the love of Jesus.